From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. For some, it was a power move, a show of strength, a sign that Sir Keir Starmer was still in charge and he'd managed to block the man most likely to dislodge him by preventing Andy Burnham from fighting a by-election that could have brought him back into Parliament.
There's no question of me and Andy not working very well together. He's doing an excellent job as the Mayor of Manchester. But having an election for the Mayor of Manchester, when it's not necessary, would divert our resources away from the elections that we must have and that we must fight and win.
But for most, including many in his own party, it was the opposite. A sign of utter weakness, poor leadership, and terminal, unstoppable decline.
There'll be a lot of bloodletting in the Parliamentary Labour Party as a result of this decision. I think it's incredibly disappointing. It makes Keir look weak by trying to be seen to be trying to block somebody from standing on the basis he might challenge him as leader.
I think they've made a huge mistake. I think they kind of underestimated how damaging it will be.
Keir Starmer now needs to consider his own position as leader of this party.
Has Keir Starmer ensured his own survival at the top, or has he hastened the end of his term in number 10? How soon might a leadership challenge come? And who will really benefit from all the psychodrama? Reform or the Greens? The story today: Starmer versus the King of the North. Who really won?
I can't recall the last time that I had such an unsolicited wall of briefing from MPs so determined to badmouth Andy Burnham. It definitely felt concerted, deliberate and orchestrated.
That's Aubrey Allegretti, chief political correspondent for The Times, whose WhatsApp chats lit up over the weekend.
From Starmer loyalists and also people that are critics of Starmer but don't want Andy Burnham to becoming a Labour MP again or be back in Parliament.
And what's the mood like today when that's no longer a possibility?
So Mondays are always a bit of a hard day to gauge the mood because the House doesn't start sitting till 2:30, which means MPs start to come back from their constituencies. Normally it takes until the sort of late afternoon to be able to really sort of see and feel what the mood is beyond just kind of being able to speak to them on WhatsApp. But so far, I think most people are feeling quite relieved that a potential row that could have been going on for weeks and months now has been relatively nipped in the bud. There are, of course, some unhappy people in the party, both cabinet ministers and ministers, but so far they don't really seem to be posing much of a genuine threat to Starmer, just more licking their wounds.
Interesting. Aubrey, there's been a great rivalry between Keir Starmer and Andy Burnham for a while now. He's sort of been seen as, the pretender in the North, the King of the North who could still turn up and steal the crown. We'll get into some of the history of that in a moment. Before we do, though, just talk us through how this particular battle was triggered. How did it become a possibility that Andy Burnham's moment might have come?
Certainly. So this all really came to a head at the end of last week when an issue that had been bubbling under the surface for some time finally came to the surface. And that was that Andrew Gwynn, the sitting independent MP for Gorton and Denton in Greater Manchester, announced that he was planning to retire on medical grounds. Now, he was effectively thrown out of the Labour Party over some historic WhatsApp messages that surfaced showing that he'd been particularly sort of vile and rude about constituents, effectively, and some of them kind of appearing to celebrate their death.
It's not a great look. I mean, just remind us how bad those messages were.
So amongst the contents of these messages were racist and sexist and anti-Semitic remarks. There was even a joke about one constituent being mown down by a truck.
Yeah.
Ultimately, Andrew Gwynn lost his job as a health minister in the government because of it.
Yeah, I mean, that does seem like a particularly inappropriate role for somebody who's sending messages like that. He lost the whip, was no longer Labour, decided to step down. He was somebody, Andy Burnham knew, was it immediately obvious that he would be a contender in the by-election that triggered?
Well, for months, really, there'd been speculation building that Andrew Gwynn could stand down and create a by-election in exactly this way. And there were questions really about whether Andrew Gwynn was slightly forced into this scenario. He was being investigated by the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, effectively the standards watchdog. And so there was a possibility he would have been forced to stand down anyway. This way, Andrew Gwynn got to go roughly on his own terms, and at the time he wanted. And that left the door open for Andy Burnham to try and launch a return to Parliament.
And he threw his hat into the ring over the weekend. Who would get to decide whether or not he could run?
So there was a group of officers on what's called the National Executive Committee, which is effectively the slightly shadowy body which controls the Labour apparatus, and it also has a crucial role during things like selections for elections. Usually those are done by local members, but when a snap general election is called, if a candidate hasn't been nominated by that point, the NEC plays a very pivotal role. And then especially around the time of by-elections, when they're conducted in quite a short period of time, it steps in to decide the, for example, long list and short list. In this case, there were rules passed by Labour conference a couple of years ago which said that somebody who held a senior elected position, i.e. as a Metro Mayor or a police and crime commissioner, had to seek the authorisation of the NEC to stand in the first place. And it's that issue that was discussed and debated on Sunday.
And just remind us, who's on the NEC? Who are these officers that would get to decide?
So it's a group of some of the most senior members on the NEC. From the political side, they include Keir Starmer himself, Shabana Mahmood, who is chair of the NEC, and because of that role, she maintained neutrality on the issue. Some might say it quite a smart move. Lucy Powell is also in that group because she is Labour's deputy leader, having been elected to that role since November. And another key Labour figure on there, Ellie Reeves. She is the sister of Rachel Reeves. Then you've got about 5 or 6 others who are a mixture of sort of union representatives, constituency representatives, and a couple of MPs. But overall, they decided overwhelmingly from 8-1 to reject Burnham being allowed to stand. The single lone vote in favour of Andy Burnham being allowed to stand was, of course, Lucy Powell.
I mean, it was extraordinary. Shabana Mahmood, who, as you said, sort of remained neutral, came out on TV beforehand praising Andy Burnham, which seemed like quite a smart move.
I really respect Andy Burnham. I have worked closely with him. So, he's an exceptional politician. He's a great member of the Labour team. He's been a great parliamentarian before.
Yes, she has generally come out of this maybe smelling of more roses than anybody else involved in the process. She effectively said, I'm going to maintain my neutrality on this issue. And even though there were 10 people present at the meeting, there were only 9 votes really counted. So she's come out of this relatively well.
There are people within the Labour Party who are now describing it as a stitch-up, a huge mistake. But what were the arguments that Keir Starmer and people on the NEC made to stop Andy Burnham being allowed to run?
So Keir Starmer was very forthright, in fact, and people who attended the meeting said it was quite remarkable how much he really seemed to have been fired up and quite determined to get the outcome that he wanted. He basically said that Labour couldn't afford to be distracted from a crucial set of elections in Scotland and Wales for the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Senate in May, as well as, of course, the English local elections, which are a really pivotal point for Labour. They've been described by government sources to me as the PM's midterms, and they will effectively be a de facto referendum on his leadership by the country, and that will be interpreted by MPs, potentially leading to his dislodge after them. And so Keir Starmer made the point that we can't be distracted from these things. We can't be diverting resources to an unnecessary by-election for the Greater Manchester mayoralty if Andy Burnham is allowed to run in Gorton and Denton to become an MP, because, of course, that would have a knock-on effect of then creating another poll, which would cost hundreds of thousands of pounds for the Labour Party campaign machine to be able to run. They're pretty tight on finances as it is. They've been out fundraised by the Reform Party markedly, and also by the Conservative Party. In fact, their 2024 accounts, I think, showed that Labour was in a financial deficit. So there is not a lot of spare money going round in Labour's coffers.
And in terms of the technical arguments, you mentioned the Labour rules that had led to this NEC meeting. Was there a world in which the NEC could have chosen to interpret those rules in a way that would have allowed Andy Burnham to run, even though he's the mayor?
Well, all the rules said was that a candidate who is, for example, a Metro mayor has to seek the NEC's authorisation to be able to run for a parliamentary constituency. So they could have turned around and said yes quite easily. There were just arguments about whether or not that was the right thing to do for the party and the machine. The NEC itself is full of dozens of people who were effectively kind of left out of this decision, so it was left to quite a core group. But Starmer used basically the only tool he has left, which is his grip on the party machinery and its bureaucracy in his advantage and to his favour.
So he's won the political game. It hasn't gone down very well with a lot of members of the party. And we'll look at those divisions in depth in a moment. But first, just tell us, how did Andy Burnham respond when he found out he wasn't going to be allowed to run?
So Andy Burnham initially took to Twitter to try and present as a slightly magnanimous figure in defeat, saying that he was disappointed, but actually very quickly issued a series of follow-up tweets which suggested that he was rather more angry. In particular, he was very frustrated and claimed that the media had been informed about the NEC decision before he was. He said that tells you everything you need to know about the way the Labour Party is being run these days, and that after 30 years of service, you'd think that that would count for something, but apparently not. And then he seemed to go even further in response to a tweet by Tom Baldwin, who is Keir Starmer's autobiographer, longtime friend, a journalist who's interviewed him as well. Tom Baldwin was effectively saying it was the right thing for Andy Burnham not to be able to stand. And Burnham just replies, "I'm not sure losing a by-election does us any good either, Tom," inferring seemingly that without him at the helm as the candidate, Labour stood a very strong chance of not holding on to it, which is not great for party morale.
Aubrey, we mentioned earlier that Andy Burnham has been seen as a potential challenger for some time now, but they weren't always rivals. Just take us back. Describe the relationship between Keir Starmer and Andy Burnham over the years.
I think it started out as quite a positive one. And, they were sort of in Parliament together at the same time. Andy Burnham had obviously been in the Labour government, and he didn't step down until 2017. So they had 2 years of crossover.
When I came into politics in 2015, the first thing I did was support Andy Burnham's leadership campaign. First team I worked in was for Andy Burnham. And in the job he's doing now, he and I work closely together.
And we actually learn a little bit about how the relationship turned sour from Tom Baldwin, who's Keir Starmer's autobiographer and longtime friend. And he said that in 2020, when Keir Starmer was running for the Labour leadership to replace Jeremy Corbyn, he was not a person who liked to ask favours of other people, but securing Burnham's endorsement was really important for him. And so he drove all the way to Manchester to ask Andy Burnham for his support. And apparently, Burnham sort of decided to sit on the fence and was nervous about endorsing Keir Starmer over other figures who were running from the sort of region, including Rebecca Long-Bailey, a Salford MP, and upsetting figures like Angela Rana, who obviously was running for the deputy Labour leadership and was another MP in Greater Manchester. And that seems to be where it really turned sour. And over the years, you get the impression from allies of Keir Starmer that they feel Andy Burnham has always been the first one to sort of stick the knife in when things are getting tough for the Labour Party. They think that he's overshadowed party conference on numerous occasions, always been sort of vocally critical.
If there's too much of a climate of fear within our party and the way the party is being run, how do you get an open debate about the direction that we need to take to reconnect with the public if a party member is suspended for liking a tweet by another political party, or a member of parliament loses the whip for trying to protect disability benefits or the two-child cap? How do you get to that point if that is the way we're doing things, where debate is being closed down?
He stepped down from Parliament in 2017 to become the Mayor of Greater Manchester. And so there's a lot of people who feel like Andy Burnham deserted them. He didn't stay and fight in the trenches in Parliament and do the real gritty work of opposition when it was unfashionable, difficult, and everyone was down in the dumps, and effectively Labour was bound up in factionalism. They think he swarmed off and now just wants to come back at a moment where he can reap all the glory already achieved by Keir Starmer in terms of that majority in Parliament.
Why has he been seen as such a threat, given that he isn't even in Parliament, given that he has a role outside the system that would allow him to become Labour leader? What is it about him that has made him such a threat?
Well, I suppose one of the most potent appeals of Andy Burnham is that he hasn't been part of this government, and so he's slightly disassociated from the mistakes, the missteps, like the winter fuel allowance. Now, Andy Burnham's sort of opaqueness in terms of his politics has caused him some difficulty. There is a long-standing joke repeated in many of the newspapers for the past week or so, which is a Corbynite, a Brownite, a Blairite and a Marxist all walk into a pub and the barman says, "Hey, Andy." And that just goes to show the frustration at the fact that people don't feel that he's very principled, that he's changed his politics according to what's fashionable or appropriate.
And what are his politics? We know he served in a Blair cabinet, a Brown cabinet. He was willing to back Rebecca Long-Bailey, as you said, who's obviously more from the Corbynista wing of the party. If you were to look at the Labour Party, we know that Starmer hasn't been very clubbable. He hasn't done a very good job of making sure he's got friends across the backbenches. Who would Burnham's core support be?
Certainly. So again, Andy Burnham's slightly sort of checkered record and history has certainly antagonised some of those on the left of the party who think that he is no sort of great friend of the Socialist Campaign Group or those who are, broadly speaking, on the sort of left or far left of the Labour Party. But he certainly does have supporters. They include prominent people like Lucy Powell, Labour's deputy leader, who was elected to that role, it seems, in spite of the leadership's wishes, given that so many ministers and cabinet ministers endorsed her rival, Bridget Phillipson, who was ultimately unsuccessful. And then Andy Burnham has other supporters on the sort of broader soft left, and they include people like Ed Miliband, Louise Haigh, the former Transport Secretary, who's voiced deep sort of concern at Andy Burnham being blocked. So there are certainly plenty of people in government who are upset and frustrated about Andy Burnham being blocked from standing. The question is, how do they kind of coalesce in a way that presents a real and genuine threat, and what can they do or change beyond just getting a bit frustrated and delivering kind of anonymous briefings criticising the decision?
Aubrey, you've been explaining how for some people around the Prime Minister this will be seen as a real win. For the short term at least, he's managed to see off a rival for the leadership. All of that could backfire if the by-election that is still going to be called is won by Reform or the Greens, anybody but Labour. When is that by-election in Gorton and Denton likely to take place?
It's not yet known, and I think it's the party that holds the seat that gets to decide it. So in this case, it will be the Labour hierarchy. There are two broad schools of thought. The first is that the election would be timed to coincide with the local elections in England and the national elections in Scotland and Wales, so taking place at the start of May. And the benefit of that is that it keeps costs lower for the party because it doesn't have to launch a separate campaign. And ultimately that basically if it's a bad night all round, then it's all at least wrapped up into one day. On the other hand, you have those who are suggesting that actually it would be best to decouple the two sets of elections and to have something earlier rather than later to avoid the by-election becoming effectively the story of the night. So there are risks with both strategies.
And in terms of this by-election, it looks like Reform is bringing out the big guns. The Greens are clearly going to be very focused on it. How damaging could this be for Labour?
Yeah, it could be a real fiery clash of personalities. Reform's been talking about potentially putting up Zia Youssef, who is effectively head of the party's policy production. He's never held elected office before, but he is one of the most senior members of Reform. Equally, the Greens, there's some suggestion perhaps that the deputy leader of the party might run. And then George Galloway is said to be weighing up whether his Workers' Party should be represented as well, potentially standing himself. So it could be a really messy and scrappy by-election, which would, of course, drag lots of attention with it. And with it, lots of frustrations being aired about Keir Starmer, the ongoing row about whether Andy Burnham would have done a better job. So it's going to be quite hard for Labour, even though this is a safe Labour seat and they won it comfortably.
Is it more damaging for Keir Starmer if Reform win it or if it's the Greens?
I mean, both are basically terrible options for Keir Starmer, let's be honest. I think it's probably slightly worse if the Greens win it, because it suggests a splintering on Labour's left that spells real difficulties for Keir Starmer's ability to hold together a broader coalition of people who are fragmenting and angry currently, who've perhaps left the Labour Party in the last 18 months and gone to other, the Lib Dems, the Greens, your parties and independents. If the Greens do win, then it shows that the argument just isn't resonating with them, that if you vote Green, you'll get reform, because Greens are clearly able to win.
Yeah. And people have been talking for a while now about May being the moment that could decide Starmer's leadership. If the elections go very badly, that would be it. Could this be the trigger if it comes sooner? I mean, what are the potential scenarios for what happens to Starmer now?
Certainly. So May is when we get local elections across England. And actually, Labour is in real jeopardy here because they have the most to defend. They're defending, I think, 47% of all council seats, which means that they stand to have the heaviest losses, unlike last year's set of local elections where they were predominantly Tory-held seats, and it was Kemi Badenoch and her party that bore the brunt of that sort of bulldozing through effect of Reform UK. Simultaneously, you have elections in Scotland and Wales. Wales, there was a by-election for one of the Senedd seats late last year, which Labour was absolutely trounced in. And so they're predicted to do pretty poorly. And in Scotland, Labour is hoping to oust the SNP after decades in power, trying to show that they can be the change alternative and use and sort of utilise the same sweeping wave that Keir Starmer did to get into Westminster with his huge majority to catapult Anna Sarwar as First Minister into Holyrood. But the issue is that, again, Scottish Labour MPs are deeply unhappy and say that they're really sort of fighting an uphill battle. So if all of those sort of things go badly for the Prime Minister, then it risks being a catalyst and the moment at which his critics go over the top. And so all eyes will then be on people like Wes Streeting to see whether or not the discontent that's been fermenting quite quietly but with growing loudness over the last few months turns into something specific and tangible and really kind of actually forces him out. The biggest thing protecting Keir Starmer currently is that all of his critics are divided really over the future direction of the party, between thinking that people like Rana or indeed Andy Burnham should be leader and others like Wes Streeting. Now, obviously, they need 80 MPs to be able to formally trigger a leadership contest. And actually, in a lot of those head-to-head polling that's been done of Labour members, it looks like Rana, Andy Burnham and Wes Streeting would all win against Keir Starmer. So the Prime Minister does not ever want to get into a situation where the Pandora's box is opened, because once it is, he knows that it's over.
And this is a bit of a gift to Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, and another potential rival for the leadership. I mean, there was a chance if Andy Burnham had been allowed to stand in the by-election, if he'd come back to Parliament, he would actually have been the biggest contestant against Wes Streeting in terms of who comes next.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I mean, Wes Streeting's allies have been on manoeuvres for at least 6 months now, and they say with sort of quiet confidence that they will definitely be able to get the 80 MPs required to trigger a leadership contest. But those on the sort of left of the party have been left slightly out in the cold. Rana is their natural figurehead, and yet she's still locked in a dispute with HMRC over those suggestions of £40,000 of unpaid stamp duty on the property she bought in Hove. So she is still out of the picture. And there are those who think that she has to wait longer in order to launch her comeback. She's only been out of government for 4 or 5 months, having stepped down from the cabinet in September last year. And so they think that she needs longer to go through her redemption arc. So I think Wes Streeting's path is now quite a lot clearer, that Andy Burnham seems to have been moved out of the frame.
And for people around Keir Starmer, there was a lot of talk about whether this was the more strategic move, whether this was the cleverer political game. I mean, Aubrey, you're a great Westminster watcher. Was this a sign of strength? People compared it to Kemi Badenoch calling out Robert Jenrick before he was allowed to defect. Is this the equivalent of that, or does it make him look weak?
I don't think that many people will credit Keir Starmer with some truly Machiavellian masterstroke, which is an incredible exercise of his power. I think they will just see this as having played the best hand that he could in difficult circumstances. But ultimately speaking, it is just going to keep the questions of whether or not Keir Starmer really lacks the authority to have other tall poppies around him keep running for months and months and months. Number 10 has ultimately taken the decision that it's better off having Andy Burnham outside the tent rather than in, but that just gives him the potential to be even more of a disruptive force and an agitator, and now he's got more ammunition against the leadership of the party.
Is there a chance he'll be back soon? Could he stand in another by-election?
It's difficult to see how a path back to Westminster exists for Andy Burnham, as long as the rule is enforced that he will not be allowed to step down from his Greater Manchester role in order to fight a by-election in Westminster. Obviously, that is enforced by the NEC. So as that is gradually refreshed, as elections are held and potentially places are won and or lost, the balance of power could tip potentially more in his favour. But having lost so badly at 8-1, it's hard to see how that happens anytime soon.
And how long are you giving Keir Starmer? How long has he got before you think there will be a leadership challenge?
Keir Starmer's biggest strength is that his critics are divided. And for as long as that continues to be the case, he is relatively safe. There seems to be some orchestration to have the King's speech in the week after the election results in May, and that allows the government to appear refreshed, to be getting on with the job and effectively setting out its programme of government in terms of what legislation it's planning to pass in the coming year. But I think some people will just question how much the polls will have changed, how much people's own individual circumstances will have changed, while there have been methods to try and improve people's circumstances and tackle the cost of living crisis, whether it's freezing rail fares or taking £300 off people's energy bills in the spring. I'm not sure that Keir Starmer will have made enough leeway to settle questions about his leadership by the spring, and I think they're going to continue to dog him.
That was Aubrey Allegretti, Chief Political Correspondent at The Times. You can find all the latest on this row online at thetimes.com. And don't forget to subscribe to our new politics podcast, The State of It. The producers today were Micaela Arneson and Harry Stott. The executive producer was Tim Walklate. Sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. Thanks for listening. We'll be back, as usual, tomorrow.